Before the guns arrived, before foreign flags touched African soil, this continent breathed in a rhythm older than time. Here, the trees were not just trees, they were gateways. The rivers were not merely water, they were living spirits, moving with memory. Mountains kept secrets, forests carried voices, thunder had a name, lightning had a god. In every village, every kingdom, every clan walked with the unseen world as confidently as they walked the earth. Africa was not a land waiting to be civilized. It was a land already in communion with heaven. This was a continent where the ancestors sat between the living and the divine, where gods shaped harvests, guided warriors, healed wounds, protected children, and whispered to priests beneath the moon. The people did not simply believe in the spirits, they lived inside a universe crafted and governed by them. But across the oceans, something else was forming. A restless world driven by conquest, expansion, and hunger for power. This world saw Africa not as sacred ground, but as a resource. Land to seize, bodies to control, souls to convert. And behind the merchants and soldiers came others carrying books and crosses, claiming to bring light while extinguishing flames older than their empires. What unfolded next was not just a story of colonialism. It was a spiritual collision. A war of worlds. To the Europeans, this was a mission, a civilizing call. To Africans, this was a war for their soul. Because every step the colonizers took, burning shrines, renaming rivers, forbidding rituals, banning masks, was an attempt to strip Africa of her divine identity. The gods of the land were mocked, demonized, forbidden. The ancestors were called idols. The sacred groves were chopped, the priesthoods were hunted, and the people were taught, slowly, painfully, to fear their own spiritual inheritance. But the story did not end there. For the gods of Africa were not passive. They were not silent. They did not bow to foreign thunder. Across the continent, ancient spirits rose with the same power they had wielded for centuries. They strengthened warriors. They spoke through diviners. They guided queens. They infused entire nations with courage, prophecy, and resistance. What the colonizers called rebellions were, in truth, spiritual uprisings. A continent fighting not just for land, but for memory, dignity, and the unseen bonds that held its people to the cosmos. This documentary is not just history. It is remembrance, it is healing. It is a restoration of the truth that colonialism tried to erase. Because to understand Africa's past and Africa's present, we must confront this battle. The war between African gods and colonial powers. A war fought in shrines and in palaces, in forests and in deserts, in the hearts of people and the visions of prophets. A war that shaped the destiny of a continent. And so, as the drums of memory begin to speak again, as the spirits return from the silence history forced upon them, we begin our journey. This is the story of the gods who refused to die. This is the war for Africa's soul. Long before foreign ships touched African shores, the continent pulsed with a spiritual order so ancient and so intricate that even today, scholars cannot fully grasp its depth. Africa was not a blank page waiting to be written on. It was a spiritual library, a universe of rituals, deities, and ancestral laws woven into every mountain, river, forest, and breath. From the deserts of the Amazi to the grasslands of the Zulu, from the rainforests of the Congo to the cliffs of the Dogon Plateau, every landscape carried meaning. The land itself was divine, a living manuscript filled with gods who shaped the rhythm of life. Here, spirituality was not a belief system, it was the oxygen of existence. Across this vast spiritual continent, every nation had guardians. Not abstract figures of myth, but present, active beings who walked with their people. In Yoruba lands, Shango ruled thunder, Oya commanded storms and transformation, and Ogun forged paths through war and invention. Among the Igbo, Allah governed morality and the earth, Amadioha spoke through lightning, and the ancestors maintained cosmic justice. The Akan honored Nyame, the sky god, and the golden stool that held their collective soul. The Congo revered Nzambi, while the Dogon carried secret teachings of cosmic beings known only to their priesthoods. From north to south, east to west, Africa's spiritual map was a constellation of living powers. These gods were not distant or silent. They lived inside shrines that opened at dawn, in masked spirits that danced through moonlit villages, in diviners who read the future through kola nuts and cowrie shells, and in sacred groves where only the chosen could enter. Every birth, every harvest, every oath, every sickness, every victory. All of it was woven into the relationship between humans, ancestors, and the divine. The separation between the spiritual and the physical did not exist. The ancestors stood between the realms, ensuring harmony. Festivals honored deities who brought rain, fertility, courage, and wisdom. In this world, identity was not merely cultural, it was cosmological. Because of this, Africa was more than a continent, it was a sacred ecosystem. Its kingdoms did not rise only through weapons, but through spiritual alignment. Warriors prayed before battle, priests interpreted omens before kings made decisions, and communities maintained taboos that safeguarded moral order. The land was full of laws, written not on stone tablets, but on the hearts of the people. Every ritual had purpose. Every symbol carried history. This was a civilization rooted in ancestry, in cosmic balance, and in divine presence. To disrupt this world would not simply require armies. It would require an attack on the spiritual foundations that held the continent together. And far beyond the horizon, that threat was gathering. Empires hungry for land and wealth were mapping Africa not as a sacred home but as territory to be divided and exploited. Missionaries prepared doctrines, traders prepared chains, soldiers prepared rifles. But the greatest weapon they carried was not steel. It was the ideology that their gods were superior, their faith pure, their worldview ordained to replace all others. What was approaching Africa was not just an invasion of bodies, but an invasion of cosmologies. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike anything the world had ever seen. And so the drums of prophecy began to warn the priesthoods. A foreign storm was coming. The invasion of faith and fire. When the first European ships appeared on Africa's coasts, they did not arrive with open declarations of war. They arrived with handshakes, letters, and prayers, carrying crosses, books, and promises of a new world. But beneath the polished greetings was a hidden agenda: to uproot the spiritual foundations of a continent. Missionaries stepped onto African soil as the soft footsteps of empire, preparing the ground for soldiers and administrators who would follow. Their mission was framed as divine, but its impact would tear the spiritual fabric of Africa apart. These missionaries saw African spirituality not as ancient, complex, or sacred, but as something to be erased. Shrines were labeled altars of darkness. Ancestral veneration was condemned as idol worship. Diviners and priests were painted as sorcerers and agents of evil. Entire cosmologies that had governed societies for thousands of years were dismissed in a single stroke. This was more than ignorance, it was a deliberate strategy. To rule a people effectively, colonial powers understood they had to break the invisible bonds that tied those people to their gods, ancestors, and land. As missionaries moved village to village, they often marched with colonial troops. Behind their sermons stood soldiers with rifles. The cross and the gun became twin instruments of domination. Churches were built beside destroyed shrines. Sacred forests were cut down and replaced with mission stations. Ritual dances were banned. Masks were confiscated. Drums, instruments that called spirits, united communities, and carried coded messages, were outlawed in several regions because the colonizers feared their power. The suppression of African religion was not accidental, it was systematic. Colonial reports reveal the extent of this campaign. Administrators wrote about breaking the native priesthood, purging fetish influence, and civilizing the heathen mind. These words formed the blueprint for spiritual destruction. Indigenous priests were arrested, humiliated, or forced to convert. Traditional laws tied to morality and cosmic balance were replaced by European legal codes. Generations of children were taught to view their ancestors with shame, their gods with fear, and their culture as something to escape from. But the colonizers encountered something they did not expect: resistance. African communities defended their spiritual spaces fiercely. As missionaries destroyed shrines, priests secretly rebuilt them in forests and caves. As colonial governments banned rituals, people performed them at night, protected by ancestors and shielded by silence. Villages revolted when sacred symbols were seized. Kingdoms rose in rebellion when their spiritual autonomy was threatened. The more colonialism tried to suppress African spirituality, the more the gods stirred in the hearts of the people. Still, the pressure was relentless. For some communities, the invasion felt like the sky itself was collapsing. To see their sacred groves burned, to hear their rituals forbidden, to witness their priests dragged away in chains, created wounds deeper than physical conquest. Colonialism was not merely the taking of land, it was the taking of meaning. The colonizers sought to replace Africa's spiritual backbone with their own, believing that once the gods were silenced, the people would be easier to control. But Africa's gods were not fading. They were watching, they were waiting, and in different corners of the continent, they began to respond, not with temples or scriptures, but through the courage, visions, and rebellions of their people. The invasion had begun, but so had the resistance, when the gods fought back. Across the continent, as colonial pressure tightened, Africa's spiritual world stirred with fierce determination. The gods of the land, long honored, long revered, did not retreat into silence. They rose within the hearts of warriors, within the visions of prophets, within the secret meetings of priests, and within the chants carried to the skies at midnight. What the colonizers called rebellions were, in truth, spiritual uprisings. Africa was not fighting with guns alone. Africa was fighting with spirit, with memory, with the invisible armies of the ancestors. In Yoruba territories, priests of Ogun, the god of iron and war, played central roles in resistance. They forged weapons, blessed warriors, and invoked ancient rites before battle. Men marched into war believing that Ogun's iron would protect them and that Shango's thunder would terrify their enemies. Warriors painted their bodies with sacred marks, calling upon deities who had guided their fathers for generations. These were not just battles of territory, they were battles fought under divine supervision. Among the Igbo, the power of the ancestors surged like a river. During the Arrow expedition, colonial forces discovered something they did not understand: the people's unwavering spiritual unity. Priests called upon Allah, the earth goddess who guarded morality, and the spirits of forefathers who had never bowed to any foreign power. Warriors fought believing that the ancestors marched beside them, that the spirits of their lineage shielded them, and that every step taken in defense of their land echoed in the realm of the divine. Colonial officers recorded with frustration how Igbo fighters seemed unbreakable, strengthened by faith rather than firearms. Further west, in the Ashanti Empire, the Golden Stool, the sacred throne believed to house the soul of the nation, became the center of spiritual resistance. When the British demanded it, they were not simply asking for a royal artifact. They were demanding the surrender of an entire spiritual identity. Ya Asantewa rose as a warrior queen, invoking the power of ancestors and gods to rally her people. In her fight, the Ashanti were not defending a physical stool. They were defending the cosmic essence of their existence. In East Africa, the Maji Maji rebellion became one of the most powerful examples of spiritual warfare. Leaders distributed sacred water infused with rituals, promising that the spirits would turn colonial bullets into harmless drops. Tens of thousands rose, united under a singular spiritual conviction: their land and their gods were worth dying for. Though many were killed, the rebellion shook the foundations of colonial authority and proved that Africa's resistance was powered by forces far deeper than the colonizers understood. Even in the south, the Zulu kingdom drew upon prophecies during the Mfakani. The rise of Shaka was seen not merely as political genius, but as spiritual destiny. Warriors consulted diviners before war, and the cries of the ancestors echoed across the battlefield in chants that terrified British troops. To the Zulu, war was a sacred duty, a continuation of ancestral mandate. In every corner of Africa, wherever colonial boots stepped, a spiritual force rose to meet them. The gods did not fight with swords, but with courage poured into hearts, visions whispered into the minds of leaders, and unity forged through sacred rituals. The colonizers believed they could break Africa through fire and fear. What they encountered instead was a continent whose spiritual foundation was stronger than any empire's ambition. The gods had entered the battlefield, and Africa refused to bow. The forbidden shrines and the broken altars. As colonial occupation tightened its grip, a new phase of conquest began. A phase not fought with guns or chains, but with fire, fear, and deliberate desecration. Across Africa, the sacred architecture of whole civilizations came under attack. Shrines that had stood for centuries, temples carved by ancestors, sacred groves where spirits were believed to dwell, all became targets of colonial zeal. What the empires could not control, they sought to destroy. To them, these places were not centers of wisdom or spirituality. They were obstacles to domination. Every colonial force had its own method, but the mission was the same: dismantle the spiritual backbone of the people. In West Africa, British troops burned shrines in Benin, smashing altars and looting sacred bronze sculptures that carried the history of generations. These were not random acts of violence. They were organized campaigns meant to humiliate and disarm a spiritual nation. Ancient masks, believed to hold ancestral power, were stolen and shipped to Europe as trophies. Priests who protected these altars were arrested, beaten, or executed, an attempt to sever the people from the divine guardians who had watched over them since the beginning. In Igboland, sacred groves that had served as spiritual sanctuaries for centuries were cut down and replaced with colonial courts and mission houses. The land once dedicated to Allah, the earth goddess, was forcibly converted into administrative centers. Diviners were publicly shamed, accused of witchcraft, and punished. Missionaries celebrated the burning of masks and the destruction of oracle shrines as victories for civilization. But every flame that engulfed a shrine was also a wound to a community's memory, a wound that would take generations to heal. In the Gold Coast, sacred stools and regalia were targeted because the colonizers understood their power. These were not merely symbols. They were the living souls of the people. Colonial officers recorded the terror of capturing such items, for even they sensed they were meddling with something beyond the physical. Yet they pressed on, determined to strip African civilizations of anything that could sustain pride or unity. Central and Southern Africa faced similar desecrations. In Congo lands, crosses, drums, and masks that held centuries of spiritual knowledge were confiscated and destroyed. In Zulu territories, sacred meeting grounds were fenced off and rituals were banned under missionary regulations. Every part of traditional life, from naming ceremonies to puberty rites, from ancestral feasts to nighttime dances, was labeled as sinful, primitive, or demonic. And under the pressure of this spiritual warfare, many communities felt as though their world was being systematically erased. But the colonizers misunderstood one thing: Africa's spirituality was not contained in wood, stone, or bronze. The sacred objects they burned were important, yes, but they were not the source of the power. The true power lived inside the people. Even when masks were confiscated, the knowledge of how to carve new ones remained. Even when shrines were destroyed, the sacred songs survived on the tongues of elders. Even when priests were imprisoned, young initiates carried the rituals in their memories. The colonizers succeeded in breaking altars, but they failed to break the spirit behind them. Still, the impact was deep. The loss of sacred spaces created a psychological void. Generations grew up without the ceremonies that once guided their lives. Entire communities felt spiritually displaced, as if the pathway between themselves and the ancestors had been disrupted. And yet, in hidden corners, in forests, caves, midnight gatherings, and secret societies, the old ways refused to die. Africa's gods retreated, but only into the shadows, waiting for a time when their children could call upon them again without fear. The altars were broken, but the spirit was not. The war for Africa's soul had entered its darkest hour. The gods in chains and the hidden survivals. When the colonizers believed they had finally subdued African spirituality, they did not realize that the gods had simply slipped beneath the surface, into places where foreign eyes could not see. What seemed like surrender was, in truth, strategic silence, a retreat into memory, into folklore, into rituals disguised as ordinary customs. Outwardly, churches replaced shrines, and European symbols replaced ancestral altars. But beneath the skin of daily life, Africa's gods continued to breathe. They survived not in temples, but in whispers, in names, in rhythms, in dreams, in the quiet resistance of a people refusing to let go. With shrines destroyed and priests hunted, communities became ingenious. They blended their beliefs with the new religions forced upon them, hiding ancient truths behind Christian imagery. A carved mask might be tucked inside a church storage room, blessed as a cultural artifact, while still revered as a vessel of ancestral presence. Feasts once dedicated to a deity were rebranded as saints' days, preserving rituals under different names. Songs carried coded messages, praising Jesus on the surface but invoking older gods within their melodies. Colonial authorities could not decode these layers. They were foreign to the spiritual language Africa had spoken for thousands of years. In many regions, secret societies became guardians of the old ways. Under the cover of night, masked dancers appeared in distant forests, continuing ceremonies thought forbidden. Elders passed knowledge quietly, choosing only those who could be trusted to carry it into the next generation. Initiation rites were cloaked in new forms, but their essence remained untouched. Young men and women learned to hold two worlds at once, the world expected by the colonizers and the world that belonged to their ancestors. This duality became a survival mechanism, a shield against erasure. The African diaspora amplified this resistance even further. When enslaved Africans were taken to the Americas and Caribbean, their gods traveled with them, not in objects, but in memory. Stripped of everything except their spiritual identity, they rebuilt their cosmologies in new lands. But because open practice was forbidden, they used brilliant disguise. Ogun merged with St. George, Shango became associated with St. Barbara, Legba took the form of St. Peter. Behind the masks of Catholic saints, the old gods reigned in secret. This was not abandonment of tradition, it was spiritual warfare through preservation. Out of this fusion emerged powerful new religions: Vodun in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, Obeah in the Caribbean. These were not distortions, they were evolutions, echoes of the mother continent beating inside unfamiliar soil. They carried Africa's gods across oceans, keeping them alive even when people were forbidden to speak their names. Back in Africa, colonial officials marveled and feared how quickly traditional beliefs resurfaced, even after decades of suppression. They could not understand what the priests knew all along. You can burn a shrine, but you cannot burn a memory. You can chain a priest, but you cannot chain a god. The essence of Africa's spirituality was not material. It was spiritual, ancestral, eternal. By the time the colonizers realized this, it was too late. The gods they thought they had silenced were still alive, whispering in dreams, stirring in rituals, dancing in festivals reborn after independence. Even in places where people had converted, the old spirits remained part of their worldview, shaping their sense of morality, destiny, and belonging. Colonialism placed the gods in chains, but the chains could not hold. Beneath the ashes, the sacred fire continued to burn, the erasure of the African spirit. Colonialism did not end with the burning of shrines or the arrest of priests. Its deepest wound was psychological, an assault on memory so profound that generations would grow up fearing the very gods who had once protected their ancestors. After decades of suppression, many Africans no longer needed chains or beatings to abandon their traditions. They had been taught to abandon themselves. This was the final strategy of the colonizers, to make Africans question their own spiritual worth, to replace awe with shame, and to sever the link between a people and their divine identity. Mission schools became the most effective tools of this erasure. Children were taught that their ancestors were savages, that their rituals were evil, that their languages were inferior, and that salvation could come only from outside their continent. Drums, once the heartbeat of community, were labeled instruments of the devil. Masks became symbols of superstition. Sacred groves were dismissed as dens of evil spirits. In just a few generations, many began to fear the names their grandparents once spoke with reverence. The colonizers did not need to destroy every shrine, they had convinced the children to destroy them in their minds. This spiritual disorientation fractured communities. People who once saw themselves as part of a cosmic continuum, connected to land, ancestors, and gods, suddenly saw themselves through the eyes of their oppressors. Identity splintered. Those who clung to the old ways were mocked as primitive. Those who embraced foreign religions were praised as civilized. Families split along spiritual lines. The old respect for priests, diviners, and elders eroded under missionary pressure. Entire societies became spiritually confused, unsure of what to believe or who they truly were. The colonizers also invented the concept of tribalism, a word Africa had never used to describe itself. By labeling ancient nations and kingdoms as tribes, they made African civilization seem small, backward, and divided. This was another form of spiritual violence. shrinking a people's self-perception until they believed they had no history, no unity, no sacred lineage worth defending. It was easier to dominate a continent that doubted its own greatness. The damage was far-reaching. Even after independence, many Africans continued to practice religions that condemned their ancestors. Many lived in fear of rituals whose meanings they no longer understood. The colonizers were gone, but the psychological cage remained, an invisible structure built out of shame, confusion, and disconnection from ancestral power. And yet, not all memory was lost. The stories whispered by grandparents, the rituals performed in secret, the festivals that refused to die, the symbols carved into doorposts, all of these small flames survived the storm. Beneath the layers of imposed belief, Africa's spiritual identity continued to pulse, waiting for a generation bold enough to reclaim it. They took the land, but more painfully, they took the story. But stories can return, and gods can rise again. The return of the gods. In the quiet after the storm of colonial rule, something remarkable began to happen across Africa and throughout the diaspora. The children of the continent, those who had been taught to fear their own spiritual roots, started to ask questions. They began to wonder why their ancestors were demonized, why their shrines were destroyed, why their gods were silenced. And with every question came a spark of remembrance. Slowly, gently, defiantly, Africa's spiritual memory began to awaken. The gods who had been pushed into the shadows stepped forward again, not with the thunder of old wars, but with the calm certainty of truth returning home. This awakening did not begin in temples or palaces. It began in stories told by elders who refused to let their lineage be forgotten. Stories of Shango's thunder, of Allah's justice, of Ogun's iron, of Nume's sky kingdom, of Nzambi's breath, of Oya's fierce winds, of the ancestors who walked beside the living. These stories, once whispered in secrecy, began to be spoken openly once more. What colonizers tried to cast as shame transformed back into pride. The younger generation looked at these tales not as pagan myths, but as sophisticated spiritual systems with thousands of years of wisdom. Soon, festivals that had been banned were revived with grandeur. Masks that had been hidden reappeared in dances. Shrines were rebuilt or rediscovered. Communities reclaimed sacred groves as heritage sites rather than remnants of superstition. Scholars began studying African spirituality with respect instead of ridicule. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers created works inspired by orishas, ancestors, and cosmologies. For the first time in centuries, Africa's spiritual identity became a source of global fascination, admiration, and scholarship, not derision. The diaspora played a powerful role as well. In Brazil, Haiti, Cuba, Trinidad, and the United States, the descendants of enslaved Africans began tracing their spiritual traditions back to their roots. Religions like Vodun, Candomblé, Santeria, and Ifa, once practiced in secret, rose to global prominence. Through them, the gods who crossed the ocean in chains found new life, new shrines, new voices. The spiritual children of Africa in the diaspora became bridges, reconnecting modern generations to ancient homelands their ancestors never stopped dreaming of. Today, a movement of reclamation is sweeping the world. A movement that honors African spirituality not as a relic of the past, but as a living force. People are learning divination again, studying the old symbols, visiting sacred sites, reconnecting with their ancestors, and speaking the names of their gods without fear. What once hid in the shadows now stands confidently in the sun. The gods were never defeated. They were never forgotten. They simply waited, knowing that a time would come when Africa would rise to reclaim the parts of itself that colonialism tried to bury. And now that time has come, because Africa remembers, Africa rises, and the war for Africa's soul ends not in defeat, but in the triumphant return of its gods. If this awakens something ancient within you, share it. Comment, Africa rises. Subscribe to Deep in History, where forgotten spirits come home.